on our summit website for later. As a reminder, please use the chat and the Q&A to communicate with facilitators as well as other attendees. We'll be monitoring both the chat and Q&A to address your questions and comments during the session. Closed captioning will also be available by clicking closed caption at the bottom of the screen and then show subtitle. And we'll be setting that up for you shortly. But now I will hand it over to our facilitators, Mariana, Conra, and Andrea. Andrea, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today to learn about Handle with Care and the community response. For those of you that are joining us, just want to let you know, I'm going to give a brief summary of the Handle with Care program and turn it over to my colleagues to talk about the resources that have been developed to support children experiencing trauma in schools. So next slide, please. Children experiencing trauma often have trouble at school. I know that's a no-brainer, but I've just got to explain it a little bit so you understand what we're trying to do with our Handle with Care program. Children who have problems at home, and these can stem from all kinds of things, from the basic ACEs, which are physical, emotional, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, living in a home with substance misuse, with a home where someone has a mental illness, a home where there's domestic violence, a home where you're separated from your parent or your parent's incarcerated. These are all the traditional ACEs that children experience that can be stressors at home. But we know there are other stressors. There's food insecurity and housing instability, which the pandemic really brought close to home. Lack of access to technology to keep up with your classwork if you're doing it virtually. Lack of access to primary care. So all these can really affect a child at home and at school. If a child's at home and they solve problems by yelling and fighting, and they go to school and they solve their problems by yelling and fighting, and they get in trouble. If a child's worried about where they're going to sleep tonight, how are they going to get food to feed their siblings, if they're at school, they're probably thinking about that all day long and they're not able to learn. If a child is maltreated at home and they come to school, they can't learn. Their learning switch has been turned off. And Handle with Care is about helping turn that learning switch back on. This situation of a child being traumatized in the classrooms and teachers not knowing what's going on is very frustrating for everybody involved. And there's really no win in that. So we have got to figure out some way to turn that learning switch back on, and that is Handle with Care. Next slide, please. Handle with Care is a program aimed at ensuring that all children who are exposed to crime, violence, and abuse in their home, schools, and communities can succeed at school to the very best of their ability. And it's not just at school, it's in their homes and in their communities. We just really want to help children because we know research tells us trauma can undermine that child's ability to learn, to form relationships, and to function appropriately in the classroom. So when you think of Handle with Care, always think focus, behave appropriately, and learn. We keep the focus on the child. That's what it's all about. It's helping a child who has recently experienced a traumatic event feel safe, feel supportive, have some positive experiences so they can learn. Next slide, please. We're going to give you a little 2-minute video which is just a situation that'll lay the framework with how Handle with Care will work. But before she plays it, please practice safe care. This is a 911 video of a child calling 911.
Now to a story just developing. A Johnson County mother is in the hospital after she was attacked.
And her own children called 911 while hiding inside a closet. We just got that phone call. 24-hour News 8's Daniel Miller is live in the newsroom working on this story out of New Whiteland. Daniel.
Yeah, that's right, Eric and Debbie. We just received the 911 call from New Whiteland police about this attack. We can tell you that this mother was severely beaten inside her home last night, and her children witnessed the attack. We can tell you police arrested a person in this case. It's the woman's husband, and here's his picture right here, 33-year-old Timothy Brown. Police arrested him on the scene. Now take a listen to the 911 call one of the kids made to police.
911, what is your emergency?
Help me, help me, help me.
What's wrong? My dad is hurting my mommy.
As you can imagine, kids terrified. As you said, Debbie, the kids were actually in the closet during this attack. Of course, we're working on this developing story, and as soon as we get more information about it, we will bring it to you. But we can tell you that the mother is at Methodist Hospital. Her condition is not known. We'll send it back to you.
So odds are, where is that child the next day? The child that made that phone call, probably at 2 in the morning, completely traumatized. Maybe that child had to go next door and go to grandma's or go to foster care, but odds are, where is that child the next day? And the answer is at school. And you have to wonder, do they have their homework? How well are they doing on a test? Are they tired? Are they hungry? Do they have a bellyache? That's the universal language for a child that doesn't have the words to explain what's going on. I have a bellyache. I have a headache. Is this child acting out, staring off into space? Are they tired? The answer is probably yes to a lot of it. And what's the teacher doing? The teacher has no idea what has happened. This child just comes into the classroom and is a little off that day. And the teacher might say, you know, pay attention. Where's your homework? Why didn't you study for this test? Why can't you stay awake? No snacking in class. The child might get detention for bad behavior. But the bottom line is the teacher is wondering what's wrong with that child. And so you can see this is a no-win for anyone. And this is where Handle with Care comes in. To Handle with Care, our number one call on a Handle with Care thing is a domestic violence situation. So I just wanted to set the stage for how Handle with Care would work. Next slide, please. So when you think of Handle with Care, a lot of people here have heard about Handle with Care and they think it's simply a notice from law enforcement to the schools, but it's more than just that. It's a three-part program. We do not have a program without law enforcement and first responders, EMS. We're very appreciative of them because after all, they're the ones that see if they are on the scene and there are children present, those are the children most at risk, and they can identify the ones that need that are the most at risk, that need our help. So when you think of Handle with Care, it is that first responder at the scene getting the child's name, age, and school, and getting that over to the school, hopefully before the start of the next school day. I need to stress, it's only 3 words, Handle with Care. No details will ever be given to the school about the event. All you get is Handle with Care. And it works because of the second part of our program, understanding trauma. If schools can prep trauma-sensitive supports for these kids, meaning they have had some training on trauma, what it does to a developing brain, what it looks like in the classroom, and what they can do to mitigate those negative effects. That's what we want from the schools. If you understand trauma, you don't need the details, you're not going to get them, but you're going to know what to do to be able to be very supportive of these children so they feel safe, so they can learn. Most kids can be helped by simple interactions. It's not rocket science. It might be food. It might be sleep at school. It might be extra help with homework. It might be postponing a test. It might be retaking a test. But some children are going to need to talk to a mental health provider. School counselors can do some crisis intervention 1 or 2 times, but some of these kids need to be passed off to a therapist for mental health services. So that's the third part of our program, mental health providers on site at the school. So we want schools to give free space for a therapist to set up and therapists to commit to providing services at school for these children with these children's parents' permission. We want them on site because we know that parents don't get their kids to appointments for a lot of reasons. Some are working 2 or 3 jobs to keep the lights on, can't get time off work to take them. Some of them, transportation's an issue, especially for us in rural West Virginia. If there is public transportation, it stops at 6. So that's an issue. And in some homes, the children's appointments aren't the priority, other things are the priority. So we don't even want to go there. We just want mental health providers to be on site at the school for children with their parents' permission. So when you think of Handle with Care, please think of those 3 parts: notice to the school, trauma-sensitive schools, and mental health services on site. Next slide, please. Just want you to know we developed this program here in Charleston, West Virginia, and we took 2012 to develop it and run it by all the bosses, the lawyers, everybody who told us what we could and couldn't do. And it looked much different in the beginning, but in the end, after everyone kind of whacked on it a little bit, we were down to 3 words, Handle with Care, which turned out to be a blessing. It's what makes our program work. but it was in it. We had it in our head, so we thought we better pilot it. And I just want you to know we piloted it in Charleston, West Virginia with the Charleston PD and with Mary C. Snow Elementary. Why that school? Because it was the busiest law enforcement car in Charleston. So we thought we could see the most difference if it was working, if we piloted in a place that got a lot of Handle with Care notice. We then created this handy dandy little notice, and it says, if you're getting this notice on little Johnny, they've been on the scene of a police incident in the last 24 hours, might exhibit academic, emotional, or behavioral problems. Please handle with care. The trick to handle with care is how you're going to get the notice from the law enforcement officer up through the chain of command and over to the school before the start of the next school day. I will tell you, every place does it differently. Every county does it different. Every district does it different. Every state does it different. It makes it a little confusing, but it makes it work in that community. You have to build on the strengths of that community and what works to ensure that that will happen in a timely fashion. Next slide, please. That's just a super brief overview of this, but you just got to remember, Handle with Care is all about that child succeeding. We want to help that child succeed that day, get them through the day with positive results, get them through the week, the month, the year, next year. We want to support them every day so they can graduate from high school, because that's the best thing we can do for them. Success in school is success in life. So that ends my portion of it. I hope I answered some questions about just the basics of Handle with Care. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to talk about what kind of supports can be offered in the school for these children. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Mariana Lenz from the Psychology Department at Marshall University, and now we're going to focus a little bit more on some trauma-informed practices that are part of the school setting that can increase our readiness to respond to children who have specific needs. So let's consider first what we mean by a traumatic event. A traumatic event is defined as a threat to safety, and that always strikes home with me because they come at a time in a child's life where the most important thing that they need to feel is safe. It helps them learn, it helps them grow, it helps them take those risks that they need to take in order to develop in a healthy manner. And when safety is threatened by trauma, the entire web of development can be disrupted. So there are healthy experiences that that child doesn't get to have, but there are also experiences that they do have that teach them some very important and some very stressful lessons. So in other words, we have this wonderful developmental system. We are delightful creatures in that we will adapt to anything that is presented to us as we grow and develop. And when those experiences involve trauma, the system will attempt to self-correct in a way to seize on any sense out there is to develop a mechanism to feel safe, some way to deal with the chaos. So when we're developing those lenses through which we see the world, and that world involves these constant feelings of threat to one's safety, then we're going to respond accordingly and try to develop a system that will help to maintain balance. So when I think back to that video that Andrea shared with us in that first section, and you hear that little voice and you hear that sense of urgency, remember that that's a whole body response that that little child is experiencing. Their heart rate is elevating. They're afraid. They don't know what's coming next. They don't know who's on the other end or how this is all going to play out. And their whole body is responding in some very significant ways. Now imagine that happening maybe 2, 3, 4 times a week, maybe daily to a child. So you have a system that's constantly being energized to confront stressors and then trying to come back to a normal sort of developmental level. So what's happening when trauma is part of a child's environment is that they aren't getting those normal developmental experiences. They're learning a whole host of other lessons in life. And they're basically developing a system that is designed to survive, but not necessarily thrive. And so what we see when we look at research like the Adverse Childhood Experiences study is that we have children who develop ways of coping that may get them through in the short term, but may not necessarily be healthy for them long term. So let's consider some additional information about traumas and their definitions. Next slide, please. So one of the things we always want to remember is that traumas have multiple levels. They can have an acute level where there are certain situations that have a defined beginning and defined end, but that can also overlay what we call complex traumas. Complex trauma is when a child is experiencing a pattern of chaos and disruption that occurs over a long period of time. So they may, for example, experience a family member who takes an overdose and they're present for that. That is an acute trauma. It has a beginning and an end, but is part of a larger pattern of chaos and disruption in that child's life. In addition, for some families, the experience of trauma has a long generational history. And so there are lessons that have been learned that are being handed down from generation to generation that reflect that historical experience with trauma. So in other words, there can be multiple levels to a trauma, not just a discrete beginning and a discrete end, but a trauma that can be embedded in a whole history and a whole pattern of chaos. So we know that there can also be genetic factors that come into play when we talk about traumatic situations. For example, some individuals through genetic predisposition are more prone to experiencing biochemical changes that can predispose them to addiction, which means that over generations, this may be a family where multiple generations experience addiction. This can be a situation where they live in an environment where establishing consistent housing and a consistent level of income is challenging. So poverty can become a part of the fabric. The point is that trauma in fact impacts children in a variety of different ways, depending on the patterns in which the trauma occurs. And as a result, not all children are impacted in the same way by the same traumatic experience. Next slide, please. Traumas can have a variety of impacts on children in terms of their cognitive, physical, and social emotional development. A failure to experience a stable environment that builds a foundation for cognitive focus and control of internal arousal can set a child up for academic difficulties and behavioral problems. That lack of emotion regulation that's so important in the establishment of a stable developmental trajectory can be disrupted by the experience of trauma. So you can have a child who is very sensitive to things that go on in the environment, and even small changes that other children can deal with easily can be very difficult for this child to manage. Sometimes that lack of language stimulation that's so much a part of a stable developmental environment is lacking when a child is experiencing multiple or pattern traumas over time. As a result of that lack of language exposure, they may have difficulty establishing that internal sense of control, sort of talking oneself through a stressful situation. And as a result, they may have frequent emotional meltdowns. The phrase we use a lot is children who grow up in very chaotic, unpredictable environments have trouble with those big emotions. Sometimes those big emotions are the difficult ones when they get angry or frustrated, but sometimes even a situation where they get excited can turn to one where they get angry and upset because they can't handle the emotional arousal. So as these difficulties arise in the classroom, the environmental response is critical. When we develop a school setting that is trauma responsive and trauma sensitive, we create an environment that helps promote the healthy development of all children and those with very distinct needs as a result of repeated traumatic experiences can experience this sort of consistent supportive environment that helps them get a handle on those larger emotions so that meltdowns are less frequent. And so having that trauma responsive environment allows for programs like Handle with Care to truly have major beneficial impact. Because in reality, when we create trauma responsive and trauma sensitive environments for children, we're recreating an environment where every child is handled with care. So we've created sort of this large cushion for development. And when something very significant and traumatic happens, We already have that layer of consistency and care, and we can add that extra support that that child who has experienced that trauma so desperately needs at that particular point in time. So when we create these environments, we help to correct the developmental trajectory that trauma has sort of hijacked. So trauma has hijacked this child's normal development and their ability to develop coping mechanisms. And by creating an environment that supports all children, then we help to correct that experience and prevent them from developing along that trajectory that leads to job instability, health issues, and yes, indeed, eventually reduced life expectancies. Next slide, please. So my colleague, Dr. Lucas Adkins, in the next section is going to talk more specifically about certain things that we can do, very specific suggestions for various levels of support that we can offer in the school setting to, again, handle all children with care and provide that maximally supportive trauma responsive environment. The MTSS, or the multi-tiered system of support, reminds us that we need to create an environment that is grounded in policies, procedures, and practices that support all children. So those tier 1 responses support and wrap around all children and their families on a consistent basis. So greeting a child by name when a child's been out for a couple of days, saying, I missed you, or saying, you know what, kids, the next couple of days, I'm going to have to be out of town. There's going to be a substitute here, and they're going to be a terrific person. And these are the things that we're going to do. Having artwork that reflects the culture and the traditions of all families that are in the classroom, that are in the school. All of these are part of creating that tier 1 level of support that lets all children know that they are appreciated, that they are seen, that they are heard, and they are cared for. So when we think about the principles of Handle with Care, if we're able to implement a good trauma responsive set of practices as part of our tier 1 level of support in schools, then when we need to move to tier 2 and tier 3 levels of support that are more intensively focused on families that may be at risk or in significant need, we can make those interventions go further because we've already provided a system of support that wraps around all children and families in the school. So when crises do occur, children know that they can depend on that school environment to provide that level of consistency, that level of safety, that level of support that they've come to depend on. So when something bad happens at home, they know that they can count on that school environment to provide them with that support that they need. Not only do they feel better socially and emotionally, but it allows them to develop a stronger set of academic skills and avoid those risky trajectories that lead to adverse outcomes in adulthood. Next slide, please. So as we move into the next section of material, we're going to kind of keep in mind the characteristics of a trauma responsive environment that the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration has laid out. So just to really quickly kind of go through those, they can provide a framework for us as we approach a discussion in the next section of specific practices that we can engage in the school setting to allow all children to feel supported and also to intervene with children who have specific needs. The first characteristic of a trauma responsive environment is that sense of safety, that feeling of being physically and psychologically safe. So when we think about this characteristic, think about the setting of your school. What is it about the school system that allows a child to feel safe? So when they walk in and someone knows their name and recognizes they're there, even though we may think of that as no big deal and we're just being polite and saying hello, that lets a child know that they've been seen and that it makes a difference to someone that they're there. Think about the classroom and the line of sight, that children can see the entire classroom. Children who may be a little bit on the anxious side feel like they have control over their environment when they have good sight lines. That we have places where children and even teaching staff can go to catch their breath, to relax. That beanbag where they can flop down and cover up with a blanket and sit for a few minutes and get control. All of those things promote a sense of safety When the environment is consistent and policies are enforced in a way that lets a child know what to expect, that leads to a sense of safety. The second characteristic of trustworthiness and transparency refers to the fact that policies and procedures and decisions are done with input from as many members of the community as possible, and they don't change, and we know what to expect. But they're flexible enough to account for those special situations where we need to give somebody, as we say, a little bit of scooch, a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of, that's okay this time, we'll let it go. So when we talk about trustworthiness and transparency, everyone knows what the guidelines are, everyone knows what the rules are. And when someone feels that the rules aren't being followed, they have a mechanism for stepping forward and saying, that isn't what I expected, and here's my input. And all families are included. The door is open to everyone. We talk about collaboration and mutuality, which is that third characteristic. We're recognizing that all school and community members, students, families, teachers, the principal, the custodians, the cooks, everyone has something to offer about the environment. Everyone sees need and everyone's input is valued. Not only is it that we recognize this, but we provide clear mechanisms for how people can provide their input for various policies. That kids, when there's an opportunity to make choices and have input into the academic structure, they're allowed to have that. So we're going on to the next unit of material. Do we want to talk about Europe or do we want to talk about Asia? What seems like the most interesting thing? Let's take a vote. All of those things lead to ownership of the environment and can add to that sense of safety and stability. So we're operating from the idea that healing happens in relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power and decision-making. And furthermore, we're teaching our students that they have the ability to control what happens in their environment and that they have the ability to make good and healthy choices. Peer support refers to that notion that students who have experienced trauma very often need that community of support, and they need to know that they're not alone. I can't tell you the number of adults who have shared experiences from their childhood that are just heartbreaking when they say, I didn't realize that everybody didn't come from a home like mine. And when I realized that other kids had a different experience, that was really hard and it felt really separate. So when there's a way for children to understand that other people have experienced this, that they are not alone, that there is support for them, that there are people who understand when they're not having their best day, that they're still a great kid. Those kinds of notions of peer support can go a long way. So sometimes it may be a teacher who shares a story, or another student or a counselor, something that says, I know how that feels, can really go a long way in terms of children feeling supported and a part of the environment so that they can take advantage of that care and support that's available. Empowerment, voice, and choice means that we recognize that we need to operate from the mindset that everyone has the ability to heal, that helping them understand that they can have impact on their own healthy choices in the environment can be a very, very powerful thing. So shared decision-making, those notions of collaboration and mutuality are part of that, but also encouraging individuals to step up, to speak for their needs, and to ask for the things that make them feel safe and stable in the environment is helpful. So supporting that child who says, I'm having a bad day, or I need to take 5 minutes and regroup, letting them know that not only is that okay, we encourage that is very important. Letting a child say, I feel too stressed to do that, and giving them the option of, okay, if you need to relax right now, that's fine. How about if we do this tomorrow or the next day? Those kinds of things let them know that taking care of themselves is important and valued, and that we're going to do what we can to support their ability to do that. Finally, thinking about cultural, historical, and gender issues is very important. Just for a moment, consider what's available in the environment of your school setting. Do the reading materials have stories that represent all kinds of families, not just mom and dad families, but maybe families who have grandparents as the head of household, or aunts and uncles, adoptive families, foster families, families with two moms, two dads. Do we have materials that aren't just special cases, but are part of our general library? And the artwork, is it available in a way that makes everyone feel represented and welcome? So think about culture and how that's represented in the school setting. Do we have things on the menu that are reflective of what kids from all backgrounds eat? So things that let them know that this school is your school is very important. So when we look at these characteristics that SAMHSA has laid out, they help us understand the kinds of things that are important when we're approaching this creation of a trauma sensitive and trauma responsive school setting that supports all children. So I want to turn it over now to my colleague, Dr. Conrad Lucas Adkins, who's going to talk specifically about some resources for building trauma-informed schools.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lenz, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to share some resources with you this afternoon. Okay, next slide. So let's first talk about some resources that were developed by the REL AP team through the CSOC project. This first resource that you are seeing is a two-sided document titled Common Trauma Symptoms in Students and Helpful Strategies for Educators. Common symptoms expressed by youth who've experienced trauma are on the first side. And this is a summary of what Dr. Lenz has just discussed. The symptoms are presented across 5 domains: physical, cognitive, social and emotional, language and communication, and learning. The second side provides a summary of strategies that educators may use as supports of youth who faced trauma. And these strategies are organized into 3 categories: preventive, in the moment, and after the moment. Preventive strategies are those that can be in place all of the time in a trauma-informed school, such as what Dr. Lenz discussed, smiling and greeting students by name when they come into the classroom or when into the school building. These preventive strategies are or they encompass the SAMHSA characteristics of a trauma-responsive environment that Dr. Lenz shared. Next, in the moment strategies are discussed, and these are appropriate for when youth exhibit escalated symptoms when they are in the midst of a crisis. And what these strategies are intended to do is to help de-escalate the problem. Thirdly, after the moment strategies are listed, and these strategies are intended to help process the crisis moment and help the youth reintegrate into the classroom environment. Also listed on this document are suggestions for what not to do during those crisis moments, such as raise your voice and engage in a power struggle, because behaviors such as this could escalate the problem. Okay, next slide. A second resource referred to as or titled Selecting the Right Interventions to Support Students' Mental Health Needs is intended to help you think about what kinds of questions to ask to understand what the students' needs are, and also what resources are available, and then how to choose a possible program that's right for the specific school, community, and district. The resources outlines 3 specific steps using a framework adapted from SAMHSA. First, assessing your students' needs. Second, examining the current interventions that you already have in place and the resources you have available to implement new interventions if those are needed. And then third question, selecting the interventions that are most likely to succeed given your school, district, and community context. Page 2 allows you to dig a little bit deeper into these considerations by spelling out some specific questions to answer at each step. So let's take a closer look at the first step, which is to assess the specific needs of your students. First, what are the perceived mental health challenges that the students are facing? It could be heightened levels of depression, heightened levels of anxiety. Second, What are the stressors in the students' lives, homes, and communities that are related to these challenges? These could include a caregiver who's struggling with addiction, or a child who is transitioning from foster care home to another foster care home. And third, how are these challenges manifested? In other words, what are the behaviors that you see in the classroom that may be associated with these mental health challenges? Of course, under each question, you may have many answers, and having data available may help you identify some of the patterns. For example, with regard to the first question, what are the perceived mental health challenges that your students are experiencing? You might notice that it is a specific grade level, or several different grade levels that are showing more symptoms. You might also notice a particular time of year. That's when these challenges are most intense. For example, around the holidays or on a Monday, following the weekend. With regard to the second question, is there a high percentage of students who are in foster care, or perhaps a large percentage are at home, but they're living with at least one opioid affected caregiver? And with regard to the third question, what are the types of behaviors that your teachers are trying to manage? What are the behaviors that you are most concerned about? Are those behaviors the externalizing behaviors, acting out, or are these more internalizing problems that the children are facing, such as thoughts of suicide, self-harm? Knowing this will help you better understand the issues that your schools are facing in the larger context. So to get some answers to each of these questions, data can help. Next slide, please. So once you figure out what's missing or what the gaps in services are, the second question, which is to assess the capacity and resources you have to implement something new. This includes the financial and human resources. Do you have funding to purchase an intervention and the maintenance costs to support its implementation for the long term? Do you have the necessary mental health staff to implement interventions that require licensed practitioners? And if not, can you hire or train existing staff? So along these lines, also think about how community partners can help. So for example, is there a local mental health agency or a university that you can partner with to help provide individual or group interventions that would require clinical training? Next slide, please. After considering student needs and what you're already doing to address those needs, and existing resources, you can consider possible programs that you might implement that fit your needs and context. So here are 4 questions to think about in this process. First, you want to think about which interventions are designed to meet your students' needs. For example, if you find that most of the elementary school students are struggling with behavioral issues, are there appropriate interventions specific for this age group? Second, you want to make sure that you select an intervention that you are able to implement given your resources. And third, you want to select an intervention or a set of interventions that's likely to work for your students based on existing research. And lastly, we know that getting buy-in from stakeholders such as teachers, administrators, caregivers, community leaders is also critical. And by getting buy-in, you'll be more likely to sustain the intervention long-term and facilitate its success collectively. And so this is where our second resource, the menu of trauma-informed programs for schools, can help. Next slide. The menu of trauma-informed programs for schools is a resource that provides a list of programs at various tiers. Programs are organized by tier. You have Tier 1 programs, Tier 2 and 3 programs, and multi-tiered programs. And those multi-tiered programs have components across all 3 tiers. This resource has 2 tables. The first table is labeled Program Descriptions and contains basic information about the intervention components, the intended participants, grade level, and the setting. The second table is purple, and it is the implementation information table, which includes details about the resources needed to implement the program and the current evidence on its effectiveness. Much of the information comes from the developers' websites and publicly available information about the program. The evaluation information in the purple table consists of level of evidence and findings, and these are from existing research studies. Next slide. Two of the programs that are mentioned on the menu are the Cognitive Behavioral Intervention for Trauma in Schools, or CBITS, and Bounce Back, which is an elementary school version of CBITS. These trainings would be for your school counselors, school psychologists, and school social workers. And since these trainings are specific for mental health practitioners, it's possible that those of you who are participating with us today would not be involved in delivering these interventions. However, knowing that they exist may help you strengthen the types of supports in your schools. You may suggest these training opportunities to your school-based mental health providers if they're not already aware of them. And then when implemented by the mental health providers, these programs may also suggest supportive activities that teachers can do with students during class time to reinforce the coping and problem-solving skills that they are learning. So now we would really love to hear from you. And we have some questions to kind of get us started in the chat. And we would very much appreciate, if you would type into the chat some of your responses to some of these questions. So first of all, we are asking about what are some common challenges for families dealing with trauma that you've encountered, and how are these challenges impacting children, families, and the academic environment? How are these issues manifesting in the classroom? And then, thinking about when you contemplate creating a more trauma-informed environment, and something such as the Handle with Care program that Andrea discussed, what challenges do you foresee? And then thinking about trauma-informed practices and Handle with Care procedures that you've already implemented, what are some success stories? And then how do you envision perhaps using some of these resources that we mentioned today? So as you are thinking about some of these questions, I see that Dr. Lenz and Andrea have joined me again. So, we can address some of your thoughts as a panel.
Melissa, yes, accessing resources is really challenging. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what highlights why trauma responsive schools are so important, because a lot of times the school system is that sort of first layer of intervention when the resources are scarce. Oh, and Chrissy, you mentioned the layers of trauma and things that go on over periods of time. I'm wondering how many of you that resonates with, because a lot of times we'll see families where trauma has been so much a part of the fabric and they have experienced so much over so many generations that if you ask them to identify trauma, they don't. And they have all these things that have happened to them, but it's sort of like, well, that's just the way my life goes. And it's so hard to sometimes sort of reach these families and help them understand that there's more support available.
Mm-hmm. And I see that Heidi had mentioned a success, which is, working in a residential facility And there are lots of resources and communication between the school and the therapist. So that's very positive.
I wonder, Heidi, because that is so critical, or anybody, just to throw it out there, in terms of when children are sort of moving from the treatment facility back, particularly into rural areas. Are there things that you have discovered, resources or practices that you've discovered that really help that transition when they're going back to, like Melissa was pointing out, these environments where resources are more challenging? Anything that people have found helpful there? It's a good point if they have an IEP. Oh, trust is a huge issue, very huge issue, particularly in rural communities when a family has a long history of having difficulty with the school system. It just makes it so much more difficult to kind of get in there and intervene. Follow through transportation. Oh, Debbie, that's such a good point with the kids in foster care. And we find that when kids are exiting foster care, that sort of transitional youth age, that's 16 to 24, they are at such risk when they don't have the supports in the environment. And the trust issues, yeah, for kids in Appalachia. I wonder if, a lot of times in terms of some of the challenges that you all are pointing out, in terms of, school counselors feeling like this is outside the bounds of what I'm comfortable with, difficulty with resources, we really kind of encourage like primary care settings to develop integrated care models where they have, so when the kid is going to see the physician, they could also see a behavioral health person. And I know, and Conrad may want to speak to this a little bit, we've kind of experimented a little bit with trying to integrate that into school-based healthcare settings. I wonder if people have found those sorts of settings helpful.
I was just going to respond to a comment about this feeling that if your child sees a therapist, that's somehow indicative of bad parenting. And I think, that is certainly something that we do encounter, when in schools we are offering, a child the opportunity to receive some additional counseling, explaining that and presenting that to the caregiver in a way that doesn't encourage their feelings of, inadequacy or that they've done something wrong.
And a lot of them are afraid of CPS involvement too. And I love Debbie's suggestion about community mentorship. I think mentorship programs are terrific.
To address the question about children receiving therapy at issues with getting parents on board. I have heard a story that came up one time when we started this program, and a therapist said, this is about your child's ability to learn while they're at school. We want to help them better process what's going on with them so they will be more able to learn at school. It's not about their business, it's about the child's business, about being able to learn.
And I think that's so important, because especially when you have that generational trauma, where you have that parent who's experienced their own set of just damaging experiences going through, they've already said, the one thing I don't want to do is pass this on to my child. And I think that sensitivity that you all are pointing to about, if my child has to go to therapy, it's because I'm a bad parent. I think it sometimes grows out of that set of experiences that they had growing up and those fears that they developed back then. Because as we say, trauma is that unfortunate gift that keeps on giving. And so that's where I think, having that school that has those tier one layers of support, that supportive environment that reaches out and is inclusive of every family, it goes such a long way. Because, sometimes you really can reach those parents who need to heal themselves is really important.
Andre, I'm not sure if you see the chat, but there was one specifically for you about going into some more detail about the resources that Handle with Care uses to help teachers understand about the impacts of trauma on learning.
Sure. You can, I'll start with our website. Go to handlewithcarewv.org. Make sure you put the WV on the end of it or you won't get there. Handlewithcarewv.org. And when you hit on the Handle with Care tab, you'll have Handle with Care for Law Overview, then Handle with Care for Law Enforcement, Handle with Care for Schools, Handle with Care for Mental Health Providers. And under Handle with Care for Schools, there's a protocol on how it works at schools. And we have done a lot of work with the Trauma Learning Institute, helping traumatized children learn, a partnership with Massachusetts Advocates for Children and Harvard Law School. And we have a couple of their books that are free and downloadable, and we've turned them into book studies on our website. So that's a huge resource for schools, if they want to do a book study with their whole staff. The Deputy Director, Ann Eisner, up there has helped us tremendously get us off the ground with the Handle with Care program. But so those two books that they came up with is a great resource. We've also, Conra, the resource that you talked about, that tip sheet that was developed, that's also on our website under Handle with Care for Schools. There's also a poster that you can put, and this answers some of these questions for transparency. We want to be very transparent. A poster that lets people, you can send it home with the kids or post it at the school that says our school practices Handle with Care because we want your child to feel safe so they can learn. And it explains the program. So there's many resources there. Is that what you meant, Conrad?
Yes, I think so. I think that was.
So there's a lot of resources for schools and a lot of resources for law enforcement on there.
And I will mention, and Andre, this is actually something you shared with I think it was the common symptoms of trauma and helping strategies form that one of your school districts laminated and provided to all teachers.
Yes, one of our school districts, a smaller school district, got a hold of that. They laminated it and put it on every teacher's desk, and it's like their go-to. They said the stress level has really come down for the teachers because it's right there for them. It's a reminder right in front of them what they can do. And you know what I loved about that tip sheet, what not to do. I mean, that was my favorite section, 4 things, what not to do. That's going to save y'all a lot of time and energy, but I love that.
So I don't want to cut off this discussion because I know we've been getting a lot of great questions and commentary in the chat, but I think we just have time for about one more question before I move on to some slides talking about what kind of comes next in our day. So I thought I saw a few questions in the chat about how you envision using this resource. And I know, Andre, you just gave an example of how you've seen the resource used. But I wonder if anyone else has any commentary, Conra, Mariana, or Andrea, about how people in your experience have used these resources, and also kind of those in the audience. How do you envision these resources being helpful in your context? Just thinking about that before we transition to our next session.
I'll add, Nancy, before COVID, when I was out there in all the counties all the time, the number one thing that teachers and staff wanted was, how do I deal with this? I don't understand this behavior. How do I deal with this? So another plug for that tip sheet. It's just so super helpful.
There's also, there's a program called Mental Health First Aid, and they have some that are specialized for teachers in the school systems. And they can teach some really, really basic sort of how to approach various types of behavioral and psychosocial issues with kids of varying ages in the classroom. And those can be arranged for school systems as well.
And I will definitely say that the resource about the programs is just extremely user-friendly, very helpful. You know, you can pick it up and you can look at, you know, is this an evidence-based program? Who's the population, you know, that this is appropriate for? So it's a great resource to use, you know, as part of your team.
And I think my colleague Shai can put the links to all of these resources in the chat again, but all of these resources that we've discussed during today's session are on our Summit website. Under the resources tab, there's a space that says CSOC resources, and those are all of our resources developed by the collaborative, not just those mentioned today, but we also have others. And there's also a tab for additional resources, which includes a lot of resources from our guest speakers, including Conra, Mariana, and Andrea. So looking ahead, I just wanted to share a few bits of information on what's coming next before we hop off this session. So next at 2:45, after a short break for 15 minutes, we'll return for a full group session on the keynote presentation by Dr. Michael Meat. Dr. Meat will provide us with the latest statistics on the opioid epidemic in Appalachia. He will give us even more inspiration to continue doing this important work that we're all doing. So please join us back here at 2:45 p.m. Eastern. That's 11:45 a.m. For all of you West Coasters out there. And we'll put that link in the chat so that way you know to go back to the Summit website to look for the join session button there. And then we also just wanted to remind you during the 15-minute transition time that there are mindfulness meditation moments on our Summit website. And we encourage you to take part in a 5-minute pre-recorded guided meditation session. So to access this session, please go to the link above. We'll actually put that in the chat for you as well. And that is on the Mindfulness Resources tab on the Summit website. And then before we close, just wanted to put a reminder that if you need any help accessing any presentations or any help in general, please feel free to email our Summit website, our Summit email, which is csoc.relep@sri.com. And I just want to extend a huge thank you to Conra, Mariana, and Andrea for such an important presentation today. And thank you all for engaging so much in the chat and sharing your experiences and your successes and challenges with us. So thank you so much, and we look forward to sharing the rest of the day with you.